Muito obrigado, Paula. Eu poderia falar em português para vocês, mas nosso painel vai ser em inglês. So, my name is Terry Vogt. I have worked both sides of the fence. I have been on Darth Vader's team for 30 years. I used to justify what I was doing to my family by saying, well, we do have a copper smelter, but it's the newest copper smelter, so it pollutes less. About 10 years ago, I was fortunate to be able to fall into the arms of Luke Skywalker. And I spent 3 years working in sustainable development, followed by 3 years at the largest private funder of the environment in the world, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And in doing this, I found some new ways to look at the world. And one of the things was that we were asked, when I was working, as I said, I've been on two sides also of philanthropy because I worked as a program officer, giving money away, which is harder than many people realize. And I've also have a small fund of my own, a donor-advised fund. So I've been working on figuring out how to have my impact as well. But the Moore Foundation, we were asked to consider some fundamental questions each time when we looked at a funding opportunity. The first was, is this an important question? The second was, and probably most important for the Moore Foundation, was, is it measurable? And thirdly, can we make a difference? As we look at today's panel right here, I want to draw your attention to something very interesting, which is the power of words. In Portuguese, the name of this panel is Resgate De Valores, the rescue of values. In English, we are promoting values, promovendo valores. I'm not sure why this is there, but it's something for us to think about as we speak. I'm lucky today to stop talking in just a moment because we actually have people who have been both rescuing and promoting values. And I'd like first to have us listen to the story from Alfonso Carrillo from Guatemala. Alfonso.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the privilege of having me here. When a few months ago, I got the invitation to come, the first doubt that I had is, what is a Guatemalan going to do in Brazil, where Brazil is a large country, we are very small. But a few days after that conversation, I happened to have 2 or 3 anecdotes that made me take the decision to come. One was a European company who was evaluating buying and making a very large acquisition in Brazil. And at the end of the due diligence, after a lot of work, they called me and said, you have to notify the seller, we're not going to buy. We don't feel comfortable in Brazil. We think that they have a very serious crisis, and our advisors, risk advisors, say, don't go to Brazil. A few days later, I live in Boston right now. I'm a fellow at Harvard University, and I had the opportunity to meet with several heads of funds with huge investments in the area. And one of the heads of one of the funds said, we are very disappointed with our investment in Brazil. And I'm sorry to say this, but I think that I owe you to share what some people is thinking. And they say, we are planning to exit Brazil, even taking our losses. We are very concerned of the situation. And lastly, a few weeks ago, I met with a CEO of a very large corporation a very large multinational here in Brazil, and he again expressed his same concern. So when I had this couple of experiences, I decided I will come and share what I have to share. I'm a lawyer, I'm a businessman. In 2007, we were under a very severe crisis in Guatemala, 99% of impunity. That means one case out of every 100 was resolved, and after many, many years. Kidnappings, extortions. Crime was controlled from the jails. Severe levels of malnutrition, mortality of infants. Schools like this went the best. And at the end, an impunity rate of 99%. So I am, as a lawyer, was affected. We couldn't sustain this anymore. I decided to call my children and my wife and say, this country has given us everything, but this country cannot stay in the same situation. And somebody has to do something, and we need to do something. And we discussed and decided that we would put as much effort and resources that we could have to fight against impunity, to fight against corruption, and to try to move the people. The first thing that I did and that we did was beginning to study and learn from other countries. And I flew to Singapore, I flew to many places. And in 2009, I heard of an incredible watchdog in Colombia. And that watchdog was headed by our mentor. We went to Colombia and we learned a lot. One of the things that we learned is the same thing that we are living has happened somewhere else. Colombia has been extraordinary. They open their hands, arms, and they show us everything. They had what was called Elección Visible in Colombia, headed by Elizabeth by then, and we copied it. We created Guatemala Visible. But one of the important things is we had to go to convince people. We had a war, a civil war that lasted 35 years. And we signed the peace, but peace is not there yet. So we were able to convince people to come together, to work together. We were in a crisis. We needed to do something. We also created a platform for young leaders and women. We believe, and we found from what we studied in some other countries, that the women are the ones who make the changes. The force of the woman, because it's concern for their children, for the values of the children. And we have focused on helping women and helping young people in the countryside to do movements. We opened Me Importa Guatemala, which basically was a way of how to connect with young people to make them understand what was going on. And we also had a commission. Our country was in a desperate situation. Impunity, 99%, and we went to United Nations and said, help us. Unfortunately, United Nations and international governments were willing to help. And there is a commission against impunity. We have something that it is not anywhere else, an international prosecutor with a group of 200 investigators from abroad who is fighting against impunity and corruption because our system cannot do it. We got to a point where our structure could not do it. Again, we brought together all the people. And the only thing that I can say is work together. I am impressed. I have never seen anywhere had I had visit people as committed as I have met here in Brazil. You have a great opportunity. You have great, wonderful people. I was thinking, only in the United States I have seen the spirit of helping at this level. Getting together, it just takes to work together, to put the focus, listen to what today we have been hearing. I thought you were saying democracy. Yeah, we need to work democracy. And the force, we have the force in here. We as citizens, we have the force. What do we want to do? To wait until there is a big crisis and that there is a movement and see what happens? Or do we want to take the leadership of our destiny? We can do it. Time has changed. Now the time requires us as citizens to act, to do the things. And it is not easy. We don't like to work with these things. I'm a lawyer. Obviously, I like to do this. But as a businessman, I don't like it. But we need to do it because we need to take the leadership of our countries. And we have to be unified, Colombians, Brazilians, everybody in Latin America. We have a crisis. We don't come from histories where there was solid governments. This is part of our history. We have had crises for years, all of us. But now it is the time to act and to say, we are the owners of our destiny. We don't have to see short term. We have to see long term. What do we want long term? We want changes. But that means get consensus. And don't be afraid. There is going to be a lot of failures, but have hope. Keep working. Try this. Adjust. But keep a clear focus. What do you want Brazil to be in 10, 20, 50 years? This is a great country. I admire Brazil. This country can be one of the most important economies in the world, and you know it. But my friends say the problem is corruption. The problem is the system of justice. For us, it was the same. If you don't have a system of justice working, you don't have order. If you don't have consequences, our biggest problem has been the lack of consequences because nothing happens. Obviously, there is a lot of people in jail. But the serious criminals and the people who is in government using our funds, how much taxes are we paying? Are we still going to let some functionaries, because they don't have the competence to govern, to take control of our money? We have in control our destiny. We have to work to get at government people educated. But we need to do it together. We don't have to wait, somebody else is going to do it. We need to take the control. We had a governance crisis. We all do have a governance crisis. One of the things that I decided to do was to fight legally, and I removed Magistrate of the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, the Chief of Public Defense in 2009, and we have been doing that until these days. It's boring? Yeah, it's boring, but we need to do it. Because if we don't do it, who is going to do it? Nobody is going to do it. And let's support groups. Let's support the creation. You have a great opportunity. You're already together. Hearing people like you, hearing about your great advice on democracy, this is what we need. We need to do the changes. And we have Colombia, who, from our experience, we went to Medellin and we talked to all the businessmen in Medellin. They were simply great. They put all together their businesses. They have a company that is a holding company of all the businesses in Medellin, of the large businesses. Incredible. Colombia is a great source to learn, but there are many other countries. There is an opportunity. It is a time of crisis. I see Brazil today as something that I have not found anywhere. A group of very well-educated people that it is great. I have met fabulous people here. Just talk to yourselves. Agree. This cannot stand, but nobody is going to change it. You have the power. You have the ability. Hire professionals. Hire experts. It's going to cost money. Yeah. How much is costing the companies today in this country to be as you are? how much value has been lost because of the problems of the economy, and how much taxes you pay. It's incredible. You're a country who probably pays more taxes than in many other countries in the world. But what's happening? The same that in our country, we have in jail our president. We have in jail our vice president. We were able to make a big change in August of this year. We have more than 120 high functionaries or high members of government in jail. Former presidents of the central bank, the president of the country is in jail, the vice president. We can do it. It is difficult. It has taken us 8 years, but you can do it. You have something that we don't have. We don't have these wonderful people willing to act and willing to think about it. And you are here. For me, it's just a great admiration to this country. I am leaving Brazil. I must say that I will have to leave in a minute after I finish. But I am leaving impressed. This is a great country. And you people, you are incredible, what you are doing. The only thing that I can give you is work together. Governance is the most important issue. If you don't take control of governance, nothing is going to happen. You can help in health, in education. But if there is no order, if there is not great people in government, the country is not going to be recovering. Values and principles. That was our crisis. That's the crisis everywhere. We need to stand up today and say, these are our values, and this is the future for our children. It is in our hands. Thank you.
This is an easy job. My job of introducing Elizabeth Unger was done by Alfonso Carrillo. Thank you.
Me llamas. Vamos a hacer cosas juntos. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank IDIS for this invitation. I'm really honored. Its members, its staff, and the staff that organized all this, which has worked perfectly. It's really an honor, and it's very inspiring. I don't like to talk about myself, but taking advantage of what Alfonso just said, just a few words about this experience that he mentioned. I was in academics for 30 years. And 1998, Colombia was going through one of its deepest crises. One of it, because we have lived from crisis to crisis to crisis, but this was one of our deepest crises when there were very strong accusations that both the president of that time and the Congress was elected with a very, very strong influence of drug traffickers and financing of drug traffickers. In that moment, at the university, a private university, an elite university, a couple of us had the idea of creating a watchdog organization of Congress and for elections. And that exists today. I left the university 8 years ago when I joined this wonderful and marvelous adventure of Transparência International and directing the chapter in Colombia. And this is just to say that crises are a wonderful opportunity to do things, to work together. In this project, we work together with private sector, with the media, with academics from different universities, with both regional and national NGOs. And I think we have achieved many things. There is still a long way to go. I have been invited to speak in this important forum about the role of philanthropy in promoting transparency in society and the relevance of strengthening civil society in Latin American countries in times of crisis. It is certainly an honor, but I must confess that it has not been easy to put in writing the ideas that I want to share with you today. May I start by saying that we live in an extraordinary continent. with beautiful and creative people, with an extremely diverse and profound cultural and natural richness, with an institutional, political, and economic history that has gone through many troublesome stages, but that has also shown its capacity to adapt itself to new circumstances. But it is also a continent with enormous challenges. One of those challenges has to do with the loss of ethical values. This is not an issue of moral or religious principles. It has to do with the dignity of each one of us, with human dignity. When thousands of men and women stood up to protest against corruption in various Arab countries, giving rise to what is known as the Arab Spring, or when the indignados in Spain stood up to demand more democracy, or when a crowd of North American people in Wall Street protested against the immense privileges granted to bankers that had caused millionaire losses to thousands of people, or when Mexicans from all over the country marched to demand justice in the case of 44 students that were assassinated, or when hundreds and hundreds of Colombians filled the streets to say no more kidnappings and no more violence, or when people from all over Brazil raised their voices in rage because of corruption. In all these cases, and many more all over the world, people are demanding dignity. Dignity is a non-negotiable value. It has no price. It has to be protected by all of us, by public officials, civil society, and business people. Corruption is an antithesis of dignity and of ethical values because it entails the abuse of power and the misappropriation of public goods to achieve personal benefits, because it affects human rights, it generates poverty and inequality, and very importantly, because it weakens democracy and causes the loss of the legitimacy of institutions and the credibility in politics. The contributions of the private sector through philanthropy and social entrepreneurial corporate responsibility to the improvement of the quality of lives in thousands of people in our countries are visible. But this is not enough. They also have a responsibility in contributing to the consolidation and improvement of the extent and quality of democracy. This requires an active involvement of all social, political, and economic actors of society. Of course, of the state, of the private sector, but also of civil society. Allow me to suggest quite a provocative concept, which I have been working on for some years now. We all have a political responsibility with a capital P, which entails but is much more than social responsibility. Let us start thinking what political corporate responsibility and political philanthropy, what we can do to work in this direction. This is a commitment with a reconstruction and recuperation of what is public, understanding that this is much more and goes far beyond the state. What is public belongs to all citizens, and we all have the right, but also the duty to protect what belongs to all of us, to protect what is public. Laws and strong, legitimate public institutions and political parties, functioning of checks and balances, and an independent judiciary are fundamental for democracy. They are the foundations of rule of law, but again, they are not enough to achieve well-performing democracies. Private enterprises and philanthropists can contribute and must contribute to the functioning of political institutions, laws, and practices. For example, promoting transparency, accountability, and access to information in activities, just as examples, as disclosing potential conflicts of interest in their activities, as lobbying, and particularly in financing political campaigns. Private sector and philanthropists have the right, in Colombia companies can also finance, have the right to finance or to support candidates, of course, and it's their duty to do so. But they have to be transparent. They have to tell who decides who will be financed. The latter is probably the biggest nutrient of political corruption. I'm referring to political financing. And political corruption is probably the mother of all forms of corruption because it has become the determinant factor of the ways people accede to power and exercise power. This is particularly the case, but not only in countries like Colombia, like Guatemala, and like Mexico, where political financing mingles with other criminal activities such as drug trafficking, illegal mining, human being trafficking. In Colombia and many other countries, some civil society organizations have played an important role in monitoring electoral corruption and in particular political financing. For example, Transparência por Colombia developed an app called Cuentas Claras that was then donated to the Electoral Authority and became the official site for the reporting of the income and expenditures of candidates and political parties. This tool helps the authorities to follow the flows of money in elections. Of course, we're talking about the legal money. We cannot follow the illegal money that flows into campaigns. But it's also a powerful tool for the media and for citizens to monitor who is financially supporting the candidates, and once they are elected, identifying potential conflicts of interest and favoritism in the provision of contracts and appointments of personnel. In addition, I want to highlight something very important. What we are doing now, Transparency Colombia, what we are doing now in trying that political finance is more transparent is being financed by private sector. Private enterprises and philanthropists must also prioritize the fight against corruption and impunity in the realms of their businesses, foster democratic values, the respect of human rights, equality, liberty, tolerance, pluralism, and participation in their own companies and their value chain, as well as in the communities that benefit from philanthropic and social responsibility projects. But in addition to this, democracy requires an equally strong and vibrant civil society that has the capacity, technical, financial, political, and the qualified human resources to influence public decision-making processes, to have a constructive dialogue with the state and private actors, to demand accountability in an informed and timely manner. A civil society that is committed to fight against corruption is essential to achieve this goal. In words of a colleague of mine, Rubén Fernández, I quote, "Social control has a double virtue. It awakens and stimulates the interest of citizens to participate in the administration of public goods and resources, and at the same time it makes more difficult to misuse these resources for private benefit." I close the quotes. This requires a legal framework that recognizes social control as a right of citizens to participate in construction of the public sphere, but also the conditions to make this happen. And civil society has to be supported by philanthropists. Referring to my country, Colombia, as mentioned in a recent document of Transparencia por Colombia, I quote, "In the context of peace building at the subnational level, social control will surely contribute to the reconstruction of social capital and the strengthening of the relations of trust and proximity between citizens and public institutionality. Without this, no peace will be possible." I close the quotes. This has to go hand in hand with the reconstruction of the bonds and relations within civil society with an inclusive perspective of new actors, It will require innovative actions and discourses that must be built collectively and with the support of the private sector. It is in times of crisis, particularly of political crisis, when people must join their efforts more than ever to protect their dignity. When citizens lose faith in the mechanisms of political representation, they use other words to express themselves. Of course, some of them are openly illegal and illegitimate, but many, and I'm sure most of them, are not only legal, but profoundly legitimate, and as such, have to be protected and supported. Most countries in the region, and they are not alone, are facing a growing disenchantment with politics, which expresses itself in the loss of trust in institutions. Congress and political parties in particular, with the emergence of autocratic caudillos that look to perpetuate their mandates by changing the constitution and the laws. Frequently, the roots of these problems are in the lack of transparency and in an explicit or implicit acceptance of corruption as something normal, inevitable, or even as a necessary evil to make business. Colombia, for example, a country that has suffered the devastating effects of almost 60 years of continuous violence, in recent opinion polls, Colombians consider that corruption is the worst problem, even above violence. In the same direction, the most recent report of doing business in Colombia shows that corruption is the major obstacle. Let me finish by quoting Franz Vogel, one of the founders of Transparência International. When people ask about progress in anti-corruption, then it is important to take into account the people of enormous courage, organizers of NGOs, and investigative journalists, risking their lives today to serve their fellow citizens. They are working tirelessly to speak truth to power. From Venezuela and Mexico to Russia, from Zimbabwe to Sri Lanka, from Pakistan to Honduras, there are activists in NGOs and journalists who have been killed, beaten and threatened, and their computers routinely hacked. Across the world, the authoritarian regimes, recognizing that the anti-corruption movement is gaining ground, are resorting to intimidation, to reducing core freedoms, to threatening legal actions that assert that these NGOs are traitors and censoring the media. And yet, the NGOs and the investigative reporters combine to keep up the pressure. I close the quotes. It is clear that no one can replace the state in the fight against corruption and for transparency, but the state cannot do it alone. The private sector in general, and philanthropists in particular, carry responsibility as part of the problem, but also certainly as part of the solution. The time has come for civil society and private sector to join efforts to recover our dignity. Thank you very much.
Os organizadores têm dito que vamos até 11h30 e depois vamos ter coffee break de só 15 minutos. Então, estamos dentro dos limites agora. And now I'd like to introduce someone who is going to speak to us about a new consensus of values, which I think I might use that term, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were just published in the last month or so. This is Heather Grady from the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors.
Thank you, Terry. Bom dia. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be back here again for the second year in a row. Paula and the organizers did ask me to weave together the ideas of crisis, values, and these new sustainable development goals. So let me give it a try. Can I first ask, how many people in the audience know what the Millennium Development Goals are? Okay, majority. How many know what the Sustainable Development Goals are? Okay, also a lot. Well, let me just give a brief background, but I really want to weave it in with concepts that were already mentioned this morning. Trust, the need to build trust, the importance of creating a positive narrative and positive goals that many different people and organizations can get behind, this idea of different stakeholders working together, and also this aspect of shared responsibilities. The Sustainable Development Goals, or global goals as they're sometimes called, are really built on the notion that we are an indivisible humanity. We all have to look out for the interests of each other. We have to do this within our own countries, and we have to do it globally. So that's really the notion behind this, and why I think these goals are very values-based. If I can take us back for a minute to 15 years ago, it was the year 2000, and we had the Millennium Declaration, where all the world's governments signed this declaration saying that we needed human rights for all, justice for all, a good education for all, healthcare, etc. And just the year after that, we had the Millennium Development Goals, 8 goals that were going to make this happen. Now think about what's happened in the last 14 years. We had the 9/11 attack in the United States. We have the increasing impacts of climate change. We have an explosion of wars in the Middle East. We have crisis of confidence in governments. We have economic growth that some people thought would really bring prosperity to all and end chronic poverty, and it hasn't. We see instability in economic growth, and we see that growth does not always turn into jobs. It doesn't always turn into poverty reduction. So these are important reasons why the world's governments and many civil society organizations and businesses, and more recently philanthropy, has come together to create a different kind of goals. So we moved from 8 goals, focused mostly on the social sector, oriented toward rich countries giving assistance to poor countries, to 17 sustainable development goals that weave together 3 dimensions of our world: the social dimensions, the economic dimensions, and the environmental dimensions. And this is very important because when we separate these different dimensions, we really won't address the more systemic or structural causes of our problems. The MDGs had very little on the environment, very little on employment. They didn't really address inequality or governance, accountability, corruption. These instead are very much reinforced in the Sustainable Development Goals. There were about 3 years of negotiations. Literally hundreds of thousands of people were involved in consultations about these goals over the years. And so there was a historic moment in September when, again, all the world's governments came together to address and to commit to these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. It's, again, a 15-year path. They will end in 2030, but the notion is that by doing things very differently this time, we really can make a difference. Some of them cover the social sector, to have access to health care for all, to have better education for all. Some address employment. Some address how we consume. Sustainable production and consumption is a goal. There are 3 goals around environment, climate change, our oceans and water resources, and our land and terrestrial ecosystems. And then again, there's a very interesting new one, Goal 16, on peaceful and inclusive societies, to make sure to really underscore the fact that without peace, we cannot have development, and without development, we cannot have peace. These were negotiated at the global level, but as we all know, what really matters is the local level. What is happening in countries? What is happening in communities? So every government in the world will, in January, if not before, begin to create a national plan around these goals. Importantly, these are driven by governments, but they have to involve all the stakeholders in society. So business is getting involved, many civil society organizations, and as I said, philanthropy, much more than philanthropy was ever involved in the Millennium Development Goals. Now we're getting involved because of exactly what Elizabeth just said. Government cannot do this alone, and we have to hold government accountable. It can't be another 15 years of, yes, we will do this, we will provide education, when actually our educational systems in many countries are broken. So let me share an example of a couple of the goals. Goal 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. This responds to the crisis of education that we have everywhere. There are many dimensions to this: early childhood development, making sure that all children are enrolled, but also that the quality of the education is good enough that they can pass to the next level. But what we know right now is that many philanthropists in many countries are supporting projects in education, but it's often fragmented. So the question is, how does philanthropy get more engaged in working with government, not only in filling the gaps, but in creating solutions together? Another goal is number 8, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Again, this has as much to do with the behavior of the private sector and companies as it does with government policies. And it has to do with philanthropy helping to find solutions for everyone from farmers to mine workers to workers in factories. What about the children who are graduating from school and aren't job ready? What do we do with them? So there's a great opportunity for philanthropy to help get engaged in this. I'll just take my last minute to talk for a minute about something that our organization, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, has launched with the United Nations Development Program and the Foundation Center, the three of us implementing. It's called the SDG Philanthropy Platform. And it's a global platform where we focus on both work at the global level and in specific countries. If you'd like to learn more, I have some materials, but you can also look it up on the web. The website is called sdgfunders.org. And we are very much hoping that Brazil becomes one of our focus countries for this work in the coming year. Thank you.
I've not received my questions yet, and we can pass the microphone around. If you have a question, we'd like to hear it.
Thank you. Question about, the U.S. is very developed, probably one of the most developed countries in terms of philanthropy. I think it's a culture of philanthropy from, my kids grew up there, I've been there for 12 years, I'm Brazilian. How do you see, and I see Brazil evolving very fast, I have seen a big shift of people getting involved in this awakening. How would you compare Brazil vis-a-vis the stage where the U.S. is today?
When I look at philanthropy in the U.S. today, a very Hello? A very diverse community, and how people give I think it's difficult to characterize givers in the U.S. because a lot of times the approaches to giving by a lot of the newer philanthropists is a bit similar to the approaches of people who started giving 30 years ago. I think what the community has learned overall, though, is that if we don't converge and concert our efforts, if philanthropy remains a very fragmented community, then we simply don't make very fast progress. So some of the really interesting examples now are donor collaboratives, where there are many philanthropists and foundations who share one goal, and they are contributing, they're pooling their funds or keeping funds separate, but working on one overarching program. And I think that's probably one of the most exciting developments.
Now a question for Elizabeth with respect to small steps that can be taken either at philanthropic levels for Brazil, things that you think, that, I know you're not expert on Brazil, but just some examples, some concrete examples that might people in this room could do in working on values and the present.
I definitely think, I'm a political scientist and that I recognize that I have a bias, but I think it's extremely important that the private sector gets more involved in politics, politics with a big P. I'm not saying with this party or this other party, a very big P, politics. And this means themselves making more transparent their contributions to political parties. That means participating very actively, not only in social programs in their communities, but also programs to strengthen citizenship starting from childhood in the communities where they have an impact. Starting with community at the subnational level is very, very important. We usually think, at least in Colombia, on the national level, the central level. But it is at the local level, at the subnational level, where institutions are the weakest, where institutions are more prone to be captured by private interests and by illegal interests sometimes. So it is at the subnational level where a lot can be achieved. We should leave a bit aside our egocentric vision of our countries and go to the territories, go to the subnational level.
Very good. Now a question from Beatriz Joan Petter from Gerdau, who is asking Heather, how do we measure and monitor the Sustainable Development Goals and at what levels?
That's a very good question. That's one of the biggest challenges when we try to look back at the Millennium Development Goals and describe our contributions. It's very difficult because we did not have very good benchmark data at the beginning. So a lot of the emphasis in the coming year or two is going to be governments working with others to establish what the benchmark data is. So for example, something like early childhood education enrollment levels. If we don't know what they are in 2015, it will be very difficult to say this is how we get to universal early childhood education by the year 2030. So there will be a lot of need for that. There will be need for national data as well as community level data. And I think this is a really important area where philanthropy can contribute, because often we have capital that we can use to do things like research or support studies, but importantly, not to then keep it on the shelf, but share it with others. So I think across the board with all the goals, we're going to need a lot of work on the data from the beginning.
I just want to add something to what Heather just said. Goal 16 has to do with transparency, participation, accountability. And again, here is where all of us have an enormous role to play to monitor how the goals are achieved. If there is really participation, we ourselves can monitor and demand more accountability of the government, but also of other actors. So having achieved that there is a specific goal on these issues, transparency, anti-corruption, participation, accountability, is, I think, a wonderful achievement of all the countries and all the civil society organizations and philanthropists who work in this direction.
I just wanted to add, Helena reminded me, we are having a meeting tomorrow morning on the Sustainable Development Goals and how we might craft the work here in Brazil on that. So if anyone is interested, please talk to me or Helena after the meeting, at the break.
Agora nós estamos em frente a grande risco. O risco é, se não avistar mais mãos levantadas, vamos logo ao coffee break. Tem mais alguma pergunta? Okay. First, I'd really like to thank our three panelists and Alfonso, who has taken off already. I think we had a lot of interesting things about practical examples of how things can happen, and I think we have to look at what Colombia and Guatemala have done, and it's just incredible. And I was really good. I think I'm getting introduced to the Sustainable Development Goals. I used to know the 8 or whatever it was, millennial goals by heart. And I think they've done a really good job right now. But thank you. Any last words from either of you? Thank you all.